Hello there and welcome to this new Stratego video. This video we're gonna focus on the 2-square rule, and as you may have read in the title, I have a special guest helping me out creating this video. He's been teaching me the fundamentals of this game, and he's a brilliant player and teacher with the player name Eren Yeager. I couldn't think of anyone better qualified than him to explain you this. He's very happy to share his knowledge of the game with you guys, so now I will leave the word to Eren. Have fun!
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Stratego community. I've been asked by Captain Dirtbag, who most of you may be familiar with his Stratego content on Stratego.com, to do a collaboration with him to teach a very important rule that is good for newer players and novice players alike to understand. Intermediate and expert players can also watch this video as well if they should need a refresher regarding this rule. But what we're going to talk about, this will be the topic of our discussion, it's the 2-square rule, sometimes referred to as 3-square rule by some in the community. Now you're probably wondering what this rule is, and honestly, it's probably one of the more crucial rules to understand in the game, because oftentimes if it's not executed properly, it can determine the outcome of the game, whether it becomes a winner or a loss. And what we have set up here is a game to teach the first lesson of this rule, and it's understanding how to 2-square a piece when you're in a column, much like you see on the board here. Our point of emphasis in this video, we're going to be looking at Captain Dirtbag's left column. That's where the lesson will be happening. And we're going to show both scenarios, one which Captain Dirtbag is unable to 2-square me, which prevents him from capturing my piece. And the other scenario we will show is how Captain Dirtbag can successfully 2-square myself and thus capture my piece in the end. Before we jump into the video, I do want to just explain who I am, as I'm sure most of you are wondering. I am Eren Yeager on Strategus, and I also have an account on Stratego.com. I have been playing for the better part of the last 3 years, off and on, doing anything between ranked and casual matches. And Captain Dirtbag and myself have developed a relationship playing this game, as I've been involved with teaching him a lot of the fundamentals that have made him the great player he is today. So I take great pleasure at having this opportunity to collaborate with him in this video. And without further ado, we will go ahead and jump into the lesson. So Captain, if you could, please move, after I move my unknown piece, I'm going to ask you to move it in the same column as my unknown.
Okay.
So at this point, right now, that single move that Captain Dirtbag just made started the 2-square process. I'm going to then move into the next column over to avoid being attacked. So that was the first move. Captain's going to move over again, creating the second move in this process. I'm going to move again a third time, and Captain will oblige as well, moving over. And I will move a fourth time over. And what you should see now is Captain got a message saying that he committed a 2-square violation.
Yep.
This happened because he was at the diagonal to start to try to capture my piece. And essentially what the 2-square rule prevents, it's endless chasing. So when you're trying to chase a piece, you can only move back and forth between 2 squares 3 times. Once you try to do it a 4th time, the game will prevent you from doing so. And this happened simply because Captain was not in the same column as my piece. So in chess terms, as most of you may know, the only piece that can capture in chess diagonally is the bishop and sometimes the pawn, depending on its positioning. But as we know in Stratega, you can't attack diagonally. So if you as the player are in a position where you're afraid of your enemy's piece, whether you know what it is or it's an unknown that's acting as a strong piece, you want to be sure that the piece you're trying to save is always at the diagonal from the start. because as long as you're in the diagonal lane and not directly in front of the piece that's trying to attack you, you will be able to execute 2-square properly. Now I'm going to show you the opposite scenario here, which is what happens when you yourself get 2-squared by your opponent. Now, what you don't want to do when you're in a 2-square scenario is either move your piece up or move it back. In this case, if I'm trying to avoid the piece, I'm going to move back in this scenario, but this is the wrong move to make. And I'll show you why in a few moments why this is the wrong move. Captain, if you can move forward. So, in the previous lesson, Captain started the 2-square process by moving his piece laterally to try to get mine. In this instance, I have to be the one to move the piece first. So I now have started the 2-square process, which is moving it to the left here. I'm moving it again a second time. He obliges by following me again. And then I make a third move into the same column. He follows me again. But now, because I was the one that started the 2-square process, I cannot evade this piece any longer. I have to now surrender this piece, and since this whole side, as you can see, is bombed off, there's nowhere I can go with it. So at this phase of the game, I have to just move another piece and plan my next attack out. And you'll see, even if I try to move again, it doesn't matter, because again, his piece is directly in front of mine. He is not at a diagonal. So even if I try to evade him again, the same result occurs. And he just keeps getting closer and closer. To no avail, I cannot escape him. Now you will see on this next move, Captain is going to capture that piece. Brilliantly done, Captain.
Thank you.
So that is how the 2-square rule is executed in this game. That's one phase of it. There are additional lessons we will be sharing in this video, but this is the first piece of the lesson, which is if you have 2 pieces in a column like this, where there's nowhere to go, you want to be sure that your piece is always at the diagonal of the attacking piece. Because as long as you're at the diagonal, you can avoid being 2-squared. But if you are in the same column as the attacking piece, you are going to be 2-squared at that phase, and there's nothing you can do to prevent giving that up. That concludes our first lesson. More to come on additional scenarios regarding 2-square. Thank you, everyone. Hello again, Stratego community. At this phase of the video, we are going to show lesson 2 as it pertains to the 2-square rule. In the previous lesson, we showed a scenario where you are trapped in a column with only 2 squares to move back and forth in. This particular lesson is going to cover how to 2-square, or in some cases avoid 2-square, when you have a lot more open space to work with. In this scenario, we're going to play as though Captain Dirtbag knows my piece. The piece that he's threatening is my general, and I know that at me with is his marshal. And in this position, he has entered enemy territory. So what he's attempting to do is 2-square my general, and I'm going to show how 2-squaring works when you have open space to work with here. So I have the first move here. To avoid being 2-squared, I can either go left or I can go right. So I'm going to opt to go this direction, which would be left from Captain Dirtbag's perspective. I'm going to go this direction again. He will continue to follow. I then will go back to the position I was and go once again. What you should see on the screen at this time is another message pertaining to the 2-square violation. Unlike the previous lesson, we got the 2-square violation when we did endless chasing back and forth between 2 squares. However, because we have space to work with now, the 2-squaring violation occurs as well in an endless chase scenario between 3 squares. And to make that happen, if you move 3 squares to the right and then go back to the position you started in, that becomes an endless chase. And that's why Captain Dirtbag is getting this message now when he tries to 2-square me. Generally speaking, especially if you have more space to work with on the board, it is easier to avoid being 2-squared when you have a whole plethora of rows to work with here, such as you see here in this example. So this is one way to also avoid 2-square rule, particularly when you have open space. So continuing on with lesson 2 here, we showed how we can avoid being 2-squared when we have open space to work with. Because what ended up happening previously was that Captain Dirtbag could not continuously chase my general after shuffling back and forth between at least 3 squares. What we also want to show, and this would be a higher level technique to apply, and in this case it would benefit you from a 2-square perspective to be able to establish dominance of a column, or in this case a lane, the center lane for this example. So because I'm at a diagonal already, Captain Dirtbag, if you could, show the viewers how I've established 2-square dominance by moving your marshal over. So Captain Dirtbag is going to move his marshal over, starting the 2-square process. I then move to the opposite column. He makes his second move. He makes his third move. And now he's getting the message that he can no longer chase me. So this may look similar to what we showed in lesson 1, but the point I want to get across here is that I've established control of this lane, which actually becomes very crucial, especially when you get into the end game. Because as you can see, I realize that this is a simulated board that we have here, but assuming a real end game looks like this, which in some cases it will, your opponent may have miners on their side of the board still that they want to sneak through to get to my flag. So what's going to happen here, Captain Dirtbag's going to continue to try to 2-square my general. And as you can see, he does have a piece coming from the back row. And see, because I've already established 2-square dominance, even if Captain Dirtbag moves his general, or rather his marshal, directly in front of my general, go ahead and move it right there.
It's your turn.
So now he's threatening me again, but I still have 2-square dominance as well here. So he still can't get me. So even if he tries to 2-square, I'm still blocking this lane entirely from any pieces passing. So really the only way Captain can stop me from dominating this lane is more or less catching me asleep and putting me in a position where I forget to go to the diagonal, and he manages to sneak his marshal by, and then ultimately what could be a minor in this case, as you see here. So no matter how many times he goes back and forth, he still can't get through because he has an established 2-square dominance over my general. So now I, as the general, have control of this lane, and no pieces can pass. So the last thing we want to show here for lesson 2 with regards to the 2-square scenarios is we want to also show examples, and this is something that can happen a lot in a game, is you simply are so focused on other things happening on the board that you completely forget that the piece you're trying to defend from being taken by an enemy piece inadvertently gets 2-squared. And what we're showing here is an example of that, where Captain Dirtbag's marshal, which is parked at square F4, is now threatening my known general, which is parked at square F2. So, as explained before in lesson 1, there's no way I can get out of this space, because if I move forward with my general, Captain Dirtbag's going to take the general on the next move. So I'm starting what they call the 2-square dance, we'll call it. We're going back and forth between squares. But to no avail, I'm now getting the message saying that I can't move anymore. I'm getting the 2 square violation. So what do I do in this scenario? Well, part of setup building is being able to anticipate certain things that can happen during a game. And ideally, you don't want to put a piece of such high power in a position where it could be trapped in between bombs. So what Captain Dirtbag is not aware of is that one of these pieces on, for his perspective, D2 and G2 is actually not a bomb. So what I'm going to do to save my general, I'm going to move one of those pieces out of the way so that I have space to work with now. So when Captain Dirtbag pursues my general, which you will see on this next move, I now have all the space to work with to avoid being 2 squared. And yes, it may mean that you end up sacrificing a piece in the process. In this case, Captain Dirtbag chose to continue to pursue. But he's now getting the message saying that he has committed the endless chasing violation, which in essence is the 2 square violation in itself. So the point of this particular tidbit that we shared here was to show that if you find you are in a 2 square situation, it's okay to sacrifice a lesser piece if it will ensure survival of your big piece. Sometimes a move like that can determine the outcome of the game if you go down too many high pieces. From here, we're going to go on to our last lesson of this video, and now I'll go over some additional high-level steps with regards to the 2 square scenario. This is going to be lesson 3 and our final lesson in this video as it pertains to 2 squaring your opponent. So what we've shown so far, lesson 1, to recap, captured a scenario where you're stuck in a column with your opponent with only 2 squares to move back and forth in. We explained how to do 2 square scenario in that situation and how you can avoid it and how you can be captured if the wrong move is made. Lesson 2 looked at how to avoid 2 squaring in open space, but it also looked at the fundamentals surrounding capturing a lane and establishing lane dominance to prevent your opponent from advancing. And what lesson 3 is going to encompass today, we're going to look at a scenario where you have a piece in a column that you want to protect, but how you can avoid being 2 squared from your opponent when your opponent is traveling horizontally across the board to get where you're positioned. The dynamics in terms of how you avoid 2 square are more or less the same for this, but I want to be able to show you exactly how you can avoid 2 squaring when your opponent is coming across the board to try to capture your piece. So again, same scenario, the piece that is parked at, it would be G7 from Captain Dirtbag's perspective, is the known marshal. And my red piece that is parked at F6 is my known general. So Captain Dirtbag, if you can move your marshal directly in front of my general, we'll begin the 2 square tutorial for this.
If you would move a piece first. Okay.
Alright, so 2 squaring has started now in the middle column. Now, if you recall from lesson 1, to avoid being 2 squared, I have to be at the diagonal. But I have a lake that's in my way, so I can't actually move the opposite direction to avoid being 2 squared because the lake is blocking me. See, the only position I can move is back, or it would be to my right. But even if I do that, Captain Dirtbag is just going to follow me with the marshal, because I began the 2 square process here by making the first move laterally to avoid 2 squaring. So even if I move back and forth, as you see here, I now get the 2 square message, which prevents me from being 2 squared. So the only thing I can do at this point, since I have space to work with, I have to move back, to which he follows. I have to keep moving until I get into a position where he can no longer capture my piece. And in a few moments, you will see Captain Dirtbag get the 2 square violation message himself.
Yep.
So in that situation, if I didn't want my general to be 2 squared by his marshal, who was coming from his perspective, the left quadrant of the board, I don't want to have my piece parked against the lake closest to where his piece is coming from, because I'm not at a diagonal at that point. He can 2 square me, and I'll show you the opposite scenario if I'm hugging the other column, which would be column E in this case. So we're going to repeat that same scenario we showed with 2 squaring in the middle column, but this time you'll see that my general is actually parked in column E as opposed to column F. That is very crucial to keep in mind, because since I have the lakes blocking my mobility to go back and forth, if Captain Dirtbag brings his marshal over to column E, he then is starting the 2 square process, because then I can avoid him by going diagonal. And you'll see that come into play in a few moments. So now Captain Dirtbag has started the 2 square process because he's moved laterally to try to confront my general. So now I have the ability to go opposite, going laterally to the next column to avoid 2 square. So that's his second move. He moves a third time. And now Captain Dirtbag is getting the 2 square violation message. So this is important to keep in mind when you're trying to avoid being 2 squared. Your positioning in the column is very crucial, especially if the enemy piece is traveling laterally to get to your piece to capture. So a good rule of thumb to go by, whatever quadrant of the board that enemy piece is in, you want to be in the column that is furthest away from the piece, from the quadrant that your opponent is traveling from. Because if you keep it parked in the column closest to where your opponent is traveling from, you can't avoid 2 squaring, because even if you move laterally to the left or the right, depending on your position, you're actually inadvertently starting the 2 square process because you're moving the same direction as him. When you go the opposite direction from him, that's how you avoid 2 squaring. So continuing on with lesson 3 here, we saw this scenario where Captain Dirtbag's marshal is trying to 2 square my general in the center column. And we showed how you can avoid 2 square based on your positioning in that column when an opponent piece is traveling laterally across the board to capture your piece. What we're going to show here next, unbeknownst to this opponent, in this case Captain Dirtbag, my marshal is actually unknown and is parked at column J in square number 6. We're going to play the scenario as if he does not know this, and a piece that's very important to avoid being discovered by is, of course, the scout. And the scout is a very underrated piece, in my opinion, because, yeah, it's only worth 2 points, and it can be killed by anything minus the scout. But scouts really should be used to identify high material on your opponent's board. And assuming that my opponent doesn't know my marshal, and I know for a fact that he has scouts left still, I want to take extra caution on where I position my marshal, or any high piece for that matter, to avoid having that information revealed. So I'm going to move, or rather Captain Dirtbag is going to move his unknown scout to try to see what that piece in J6 is. So, what makes a scout's movement much different from every other piece, much like a rook in chess, it can travel multiple squares in one move if it has the space to do so. So getting 2 squared by a scout oftentimes can happen very easily, especially if you as the opponent are unaware of what pieces are left on the board for enemy territory. So as we can see here, Captain Dirtbag moved his scout all the way over to scout the piece on J6, which happens to be my marshal. In doing that move, he actually started the 2 square process because instead of moving 1 square laterally to begin it, he moved multiple squares. So in essence, the 2 square process is the same even when you're trying to avoid a scout, because whether he jumps 1 square, 2 squares, 3 squares, etc., he's still trying to get into the same column I'm in to see what my piece is. So I'm going to oblige by moving my unknown marshal to column I. He moves the scout to column I, making the second move of the 2 square process. I move my unknown marshal again. He moves the scout again. And now Captain Dirtbag once again is getting the 2 square violation, indicating he can't make that move. So this is important to know with regards to avoiding 2 squaring from scouts. The rules are the same. You just have to be extra wary of how many scouts may still be on the board. And the other piece of advice that may be worth taking from this, if you have a very high piece you don't want revealed, be very careful of where you place them in a column, because in this case I'm actually in the middle of a column, as you can see. Because depending on the number of scouts your opponent has, there could even be a scout, for all I know, in column I or column J. So, for the purpose of this tutorial, we're really just showing how to avoid 2 squaring when you do have the power piece in a column like this. But generally speaking, if you can avoid putting a piece in the column like that, risking the potential of being scouted, it's definitely preferred that you try to protect that piece for as long as you can. So with that same scenario I showed before, where my unknown marshal was parked along column J, the scenario you're seeing here is my marshal is now parked along column I, hugging the lake as opposed to the far wall. This simple change in positioning is going to have a dramatic impact, and you will see in a few moments why that is the case. So now Captain Dirtbag has revealed his scout to scout my unknown piece parked at column I. So I can't move into column H to avoid being 2 squared because the lake is there. So the only spots I can move are either to my left, backwards, or forwards. I'm going to opt to move to the left. But the problem with this move is I've started the 2 square process. That being my first move. So if I move a second time, I'm going to end up being 2 squared by this scout. And I move back because it's the only other spot I can move to. And now my marshal has been scouted. My unknown marshal in this instance. So it's interesting to note here that by simply being in one column versus the other, I was able to avoid being 2 squared by a scout if I was parked along the far wall, in this case column J. But because I was parked in column I in this instance, and Captain Dirtbag had a scout on the right quadrant of the board, because he had the advantage of bringing the scout over multiple squares to scout my unknown in column I unfortunately put myself in a 2 square scenario. That's why it's so important to keep track of your opponent's graveyard to see what the score is in terms of how many scouts he has left. Because again, depending on positioning and how many he has, that can very much influence whether or not there's a good chance my supreme piece could be scouted at some point. That concludes lesson 3 of the 2 square tutorial. We covered a good bit of material in this video, and I hope that it serves good purpose for everyone alike on the Stratego site. I want to also thank Captain Dirtbag for giving me this opportunity to explain and elaborate more on this rule and how to execute it properly, and also understand how to mis-execute, if you will, where you inadvertently two-square yourself. So, hope to see everyone on Stratego. As I mentioned before, my profile name on the site is Eren Yeager. I do play some ranked and friendly games here and there, so maybe I'll play you one of these days as well. But I want to thank you all for your time and attention on this lesson. And I want to thank Captain Dirtbag again for his participation in this collaboration. Have a great day, everyone.